David was exhausted, drowning in deadlines and single fatherhood, when his billionaire boss forced him into a high-end matchmaking service. He expected a boring dinner with a corporate snob. He never anticipated that the woman walking into the Michelin-starred restaurant to meet him would be the ruthless CEO herself. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:15 a.m., a harsh, grating sound that pulled David Hayes from a fleeting dream of uninterrupted sleep. He rubbed his eyes, the chronic ache in his lower back, a familiar morning greeting, and swung his legs out of bed in his modest Oak Park home. At 34, David felt a decade older. He was a senior structural engineer, a widower, and, most importantly, the sole universe for a 7-year-old girl named Chloe. Since his wife passed away from early-onset breast cancer 3 years ago, David's life had been reduced to a relentless, unyielding schedule. Wake up, pack lunches, braid hair, commute via the L train to downtown Chicago, stare at blueprints until his eyes blurred, commute back, cook dinner, read bedtime stories, collapse, repeat. There was no room for error, and certainly no room for romance. His employer was Kensington Global, a monolithic real estate development firm headquartered in a gleaming glass tower on Wacker Drive. At the top of that tower sat Victoria Kensington, inheriting the company at 26 after her father's sudden, fatal heart attack. Victoria had spent the last 8 years transforming a successful national firm into a ruthless global empire. The financial press called her a visionary. Her employees called her the Iron Orchid, beautiful, immaculate, and utterly unyielding. Worth an estimated $2.4 billion, Victoria was a fixture in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, known for firing executives mid-sentence if they bored her. David actively avoided the executive floors. He liked his math, his steel stress tests, and his quiet cubicle. But on a rainy Tuesday in October, avoidance was no longer an option. Kensington Global was preparing to break ground on the Lakeside Pinnacle, an $800 million residential high-rise. During a final review of the architectural schematics, David caught something. It wasn't glaring, but it was there. The wind shear calculations for the upper-level cantilevered balconies were based on outdated meteorological data. The current steel supplier's materials would be stretched to their absolute tensile limits during a severe Chicago winter storm. He flagged it to his manager, who told him to ignore it. "We are breaking ground in 2 weeks, Hayes. If we change suppliers now, we delay the project by 3 months and hemorrhage millions. Keep your mouth shut." David couldn't. He thought about the families who would live in those apartments. During the final executive sign-off meeting, a massive gathering of 30 people in a boardroom that cost more than David's lifetime earnings, Victoria Kensington sat at the head of the table. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe chignon, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the room. "Are there any final impediments before we authorize the transfer of funds?" Victoria asked, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of absolute authority. The room was silent. David's manager smiled nervously. "None, Miss Kensington. We are greenlit." David's heart hammered against his ribs. He thought of Chloe's tuition, his mortgage, his precarious stability. He stood up anyway. "Actually, there is a problem." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. 30 pairs of eyes snapped to him. Victoria slowly turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "And you are David Hayes, senior structural engineer." David swallowed hard, projecting his voice. "The wind shear math on the upper balconies is flawed. If we use the current steel composite, we risk microfractures within a decade. It needs a structural redesign." His manager turned pale. "Miss Kensington, I assure you, Mr. Hayes is overstepping." "Quiet," Victoria snapped, not looking away from David. "Explain yourself, Mr. Hayes. You have exactly 2 minutes before I fire you for wasting my time." David didn't flinch. He walked to the digital whiteboard, pulled up the schematics, and ran through the physics. He didn't use jargon to hide behind. He used plain, undeniable mathematics. He spoke with the quiet, desperate confidence of a man who knew he was right. When he finished, the room held its breath. Victoria stared at the board, then at David. "You're telling me my chief architect, my head of engineering, and a third-party consulting firm all missed a catastrophic flaw that a senior engineer caught on a Tuesday morning?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." Suddenly, David's cell phone buzzed loudly in his pocket. It was a strict violation of boardroom etiquette. He silenced it, but it immediately buzzed again. A quick glance at the screen made his stomach drop. It was the school nurse. "I apologize, Miss Kensington," David said, his voice tightening. "I have to take this. It's my daughter's school. We are in the middle of a multi-million-dollar crisis, Mr. Hayes," Victoria said, her eyes narrowing. "I know, and I stand by my math, but I am a single father, and my daughter is sick. You can fire me if you need to, but I am leaving." David closed his laptop, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the boardroom, fully expecting his keycard to be deactivated by the time he reached the lobby. He wasn't fired. In fact, the next day, the Lakeside Pinnacle project was halted. The chief architect was quietly let go, and David found a promotion notice in his inbox, doubling his salary. But Victoria Kensington's interest didn't stop at the engineering flaw. She had her executive assistant, Pamela Davies, run a quiet background check on David Hayes. When Victoria read the file late that night in her penthouse, she felt an unfamiliar twinge in her chest. The man was a widower. He worked 60-hour weeks, took 0 vacation days, and spent every remaining second with his little girl. He had no social life, no support system, and carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without complaining. Victoria, who lived in a gilded cage of wealth, surrounded by sycophants and users, found herself profoundly fascinated by this genuine, exhaustingly honorable man. 2 days later, David was called into the HR office. "Mr. Hayes, Kensington Global is implementing a new executive wellness initiative," the HR director said, sliding a sleek, black envelope across the desk. "Miss Kensington personally requested you be the first recipient." David opened it. It was a prepaid, ultra-exclusive membership to Bespoke Connections, Chicago's most elite matchmaking agency. The initiation fee alone was $50,000. "A matchmaker?" David stared at it, bewildered. "I don't have time for this. I have a 7-year-old. I don't want this." "It's non-refundable, David," the HR director whispered, leaning in. "And you do not reject a personal gift from Victoria Kensington. Just go on a few dates. Consider it an occupational hazard." Reluctantly, David agreed to play the game. He assumed Victoria Kensington, in her detached, billionaire mindset, viewed human connection as just another logistical problem to be outsourced and solved. Engineer working too hard. Buy him a girlfriend. Increase productivity. It was cold, calculating, and perfectly in character for the Iron Orchid. Bespoke Connections did not mess around. They subjected David to rigorous personality tests, wardrobe consultations, and psychological profiling. They assured him they only catered to Chicago's elite doctors, lawyers, venture capitalists. His first date was a disaster. Her name was Samantha, a corporate litigator who spent the entire dinner at Le Diplomate complaining about her paralegals and aggressively checking her Rolex. When David mentioned he had a daughter, Samantha physically recoiled. "Oh," she said, sipping her martini. "I thought Bespoke screened for baggage." David paid the bill, left the restaurant, and bought a greasy slice of deep dish pizza on the way home, feeling more isolated than ever. His second date was worse. A gallery owner who spent 2 hours trying to convince him that his traditional values were stifling his aura. The following Monday, David was in the private executive elevator, heading to the 50th floor to deliver revised blueprints, when the doors opened and Victoria Kensington stepped in. She was flanked by her usual security detail, but she waved them off, letting the doors close and leaving just the two of them in the mahogany-paneled cab. The silence was thick. David stared at the floor, numbers ticking upward. "I read the feedback reports from the agency, David," Victoria said suddenly, her voice cutting through the hum of the elevator. David blinked, turning to her. You read my dating feedback? I am the CEO. I monitor my investments, she replied smoothly, though a faint blush crept up her pale neck. Samantha was an abrasive narcissist, and the gallery owner lacked basic intellect. I apologize. The agency's algorithm is clearly flawed. David couldn't help it. He let out a short, tired laugh. The sheer absurdity of a billionaire apologizing for a matchmaking algorithm broke through his professional filter. With all due respect, Miss Kensington, it's not the algorithm. It's me. I'm a 34-year-old widower with a kid, a mortgage, and a bedtime of 9:30 p.m. I don't fit into the elite Chicago dating scene. I appreciate the bonus, but please, save your money. Victoria looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the slight fraying at the collar of his shirt, and the genuine warmth that radiated from him despite his exhaustion. The agency is fired, Victoria said as the elevator chimed for the 50th floor. She stepped out, but paused, looking back over her shoulder. I'll handle this myself. I know someone. Her name is Clara. She's grounded, brilliant, and loves children. She doesn't care about the elite scene. I will make the reservation. Before David could protest, the doors slid shut. By Wednesday, an email arrived from Pamela Davies. Reservation confirmed. Alinea, Friday, 8 p.m. Dress code, formal, do not be late. David's stomach tied itself in knots. Alinea was a 3-Michelin-star restaurant in Lincoln Park. You couldn't just get a table there. You had to know God, or apparently, Victoria Kensington. He hired Mrs. Higgins, his reliable elderly neighbor, to watch Chloe. He pulled his only tailored suit out of the garment bag, ironed a crisp white shirt, and spent 20 minutes trying to remember how to tie a half-Windsor knot. As he took an Uber to Lincoln Park, the rain lashed against the windows. He felt entirely out of his depth. What kind of woman was friends with Victoria Kensington? Probably another cutthroat executive who would scrutinize his salary and judge his shoes. He arrived at Alinea exactly at 7:55 p.m. The interior was a masterpiece of modern, understated luxury. The maitre d', a man who carried himself with the severity of a symphony conductor, looked at him. Name? David Hayes. I believe I'm meeting a Clara? The maitre d's posture shifted immediately into extreme deference. Ah, yes, Mr. Hayes. Your party has already arrived. Please, follow me. David was led through the hushed, ambiently lit dining room, past tables of Chicago's wealthiest power players. They approached a secluded booth tucked away in a private, glass-walled alcove overlooking a serene interior courtyard. A woman was seated at the table, her back to him. She was wearing a stunning, backless, emerald green evening gown that caught the low light. Her dark hair cascaded in loose waves down her shoulders, a stark contrast to the severe buns he was used to seeing on the women in his corporate sphere. Enjoy your evening, sir, the maitre d' murmured, stepping away. David took a breath, plastering a polite, friendly smile on his face. Hi, Clara. I'm David. It's incredibly nice to. The woman turned around. David's voice died in his throat. His brain short-circuited. He stared, completely paralyzed, as the blood drained from his face. It wasn't Clara. Sitting across from him, looking softer, more radiant, and infinitely more vulnerable than she ever had in the boardroom, was Victoria Kensington. She offered a small, hesitant smile that entirely transformed her face. She gestured gracefully to the empty chair opposite her. Please, sit down, David, Victoria said, her voice lacking its usual cold authority. It was quiet, almost nervous. I have a confession to make. Clara is a figment of my imagination. She doesn't exist. David gripped the back of the chair, his mind racing. Miss Kensington? What? What is this? Victoria picked up her crystal water glass, taking a slow sip as she held his gaze. I couldn't stand the thought of sending you on another terrible date. And, to be entirely honest, I didn't want the reservation to go to waste. She paused, the iron orchid suddenly looking very human. I wanted to be the one sitting across from you. I hope you don't mind. David remained frozen, his hand still hovering over the back of the dining chair. The air in the private alcove of Alinea felt suddenly thin. He looked at the emerald gown, the soft lighting catching the gold flecks in Victoria Kensington's eyes, and then mentally superimposed the image of the ruthless CEO who had nearly fired him a week prior. "Miss Kensington," David finally managed, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "With respect, this is a massive HR violation. You are my employer. I cannot sit here." "It's Victoria tonight, David," she said smoothly, though he caught the slight tremor in her fingers as she set her glass down. "And technically, you are off the clock. Furthermore, I own the HR department. If they have a problem with it, I will simply fire them. Please, sit." He slowly lowered himself into the chair, feeling as though he were stepping onto a live minefield. A waiter appeared instantly, poured a vintage Bordeaux, and vanished just as quickly. "Why?" David asked, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "You are a billionaire. You could have your pick of hedge fund managers, senators, or European royalty. Why are you ambushing a widowed structural engineer who drives a 6-year-old Honda Civic?" Victoria offered a wry, self-deprecating smile. "Because hedge fund managers only want to talk about their portfolios. Senators only want access to my donor network. And European royalty usually comes with a crumbling castle I'd be expected to finance." She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. 2 years ago, I was engaged to Harrison Lockwood. You know Lockwood International?" David nodded. They were Kensington Global's biggest rival in commercial real estate. "Harrison and I were the perfect corporate merger," Victoria continued, her tone turning bitter. "The press loved it. My board of directors was ecstatic. A month before the wedding, my private investigator, a necessary evil in my tax bracket, handed me a file. Harrison had been sleeping with his chief of staff for 3 years. He didn't love me, David. He loved my majority shares in the Fulton Market Development Project." She looked down at her hands. "I live in a world where every single interaction is transactional. Everyone wants something, a promotion, a loan, a favor, a headline. But you stood up in a room full of the most powerful people in Chicago, risked your livelihood, and told me I was wrong, not for personal gain, but because you were worried about the safety of people you would never even meet. And then you walked out on me because your daughter had a fever." Victoria's eyes met his, piercing and entirely stripped of their corporate armor. "Do you have any idea how rare you are, David Hayes? I don't want a network connection tonight. I just wanted to have dinner with a good man. Is that so terrible?" David exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. The sheer vulnerability in her confession disarmed him completely. He took a sip of the Bordeaux. It tasted like velvet and money. "My daughter, Chloe, had strep throat," David said quietly, a small smile finally breaking through. "And, for the record, I was terrified when I walked out of that boardroom. I spent the entire L-train ride home calculating how long my savings would last if you blacklisted me from the industry." Victoria laughed, a genuine, warm sound that filled the small space. "I considered it for about 3 seconds. Then I looked at your math. You saved my company $40 million in future litigation and structural repairs. The ice wasn't just broken, it was shattered. Over the next 3 hours, they didn't talk about blueprints, wind shear, or corporate mergers. They experienced the theatrical, multi-sensory tasting menu that Alinea was famous for laughing as they ate green apple helium balloons and watched chefs paint dessert directly onto their table. David talked about his late wife, Sarah, and the crushing, hollow grief that followed her passing. He talked about the sheer terror of braiding a little girl's hair for the first time, and how Chloe was obsessed with marine biology. Victoria listened with an intensity that made him feel like he was the only person in the world. In turn, she spoke about the crushing weight of inheriting an empire at 26, the isolation of power, and her secret, unfulfilled dream of designing affordable, sustainable urban housing rather than just luxury high-rises. By the time the bill arrived, which Victoria discreetly handled before David could even reach for his wallet, he realized he hadn't thought about his exhaustion, his mortgage, or his loneliness all night. For the first time in 3 years, David Hayes felt completely alive. They walked out of the restaurant together, the October rain having cleared into a crisp, cool autumn night. The valet brought Victoria's sleek, black Maybach to the curb. "I had a wonderful time, Victoria," David said, stuffing his hands into his coat pockets. "I really did. Thank you. I'll have my driver take you home, David," she replied, stepping closer to him. The distance between them had closed significantly over the course of the evening. She looked up at him, her eyes soft. "Perhaps we could..." Flash. The sudden burst of blinding white light made David flinch, throwing an arm up to shield his eyes. Flash. 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 "Victoria! Over here! Victoria! Who's the mystery man?" Out of the shadows of the Lincoln Park alleyway, 3 paparazzi photographers materialized, their cameras clicking furiously. The rapid-fire shutter sounds sounded like machine gun fire. Victoria's demeanor changed in a microsecond. The soft, vulnerable woman vanished, replaced instantly by the iron orchid. Her jaw set, her posture straightened, and she smoothly slipped on a pair of dark designer sunglasses despite the late hour. "Miss Kensington, is this a new romance? Are you over Harrison Lockwood?" a photographer shouted, shoving a microphone toward them. David was paralyzed, his heart hammering as a camera lens was thrust mere inches from his face. "Hey, back off!" he barked, stepping defensively in front of Victoria. "David, don't engage," Victoria said sharply, grabbing his arm. Her security detail, previously waiting by the car, surged forward, aggressively pushing the photographers back to create a physical barrier. "Get in the car, now." She practically shoved him into the back seat of the Maybach, diving in right behind him. The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off the shouts and the blinding flashes. The tinted windows plunged them into sudden, suffocating darkness. "Drive," Victoria ordered the chauffeur, her voice tight with fury. "Get us out of here." The luxury car pulled away from the curb, leaving the photographers scrambling in the rearview mirror. David sat frozen against the leather seats, his breathing shallow. His quiet, anonymous life had just been violently dragged into the spotlight. Victoria pulled off her sunglasses, burying her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry, David. I thought we were discreet. Someone at the restaurant must have tipped them off." David looked out the window at the passing streetlights, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Who were they? "Scavengers," she spat bitterly. "They sell to Page 6, TMZ, local tabloids. By tomorrow morning, those photos will be everywhere." She turned to him, her eyes pleading. "I have a PR team. I will handle it. I promise you, I will keep your name out of it." But as David watched the rain start to fall again, streaking the heavily tinted glass, he knew it was a promise a billionaire couldn't keep. The damage was already done. Victoria was wrong. Her PR team couldn't contain it. By 8 a.m. on Monday, David's phone was vibrating off his kitchen counter. He stared at the screen, a sick feeling washing over him as he poured a bowl of Cheerios for Chloe. It was an article from Crane's Chicago Business, aggregated from a vicious Page 6 exclusive. The headline screamed, "The Iron Orchid's New Pet. Billionaire Victoria Kensington dines with subordinate following suspicious promotion." Below the headline was a high-resolution, blindingly lit photograph of David stepping protectively in front of Victoria outside Alinea. His face was crystal clear. The article detailed his exact position at Kensington Global, his salary jump, and heavily implied that his promotion was a direct result of a romantic entanglement with the CEO. "Daddy, why is your phone buzzing so much?" Chloe asked, swinging her legs under the kitchen table, oblivious to the fact that her father's face was currently plastered across the internet. "Just work stuff, sweetie," David lied smoothly, kissing the top of her head. "Eat your cereal. We can't miss the bus." When David arrived at the Kensington Global Tower, the atmosphere was toxic. The security guards in the lobby gave him sideways glances. As he walked through the engineering department, conversations abruptly stopped. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues burning into his back. To them, he was no longer the brilliant engineer who caught a fatal flaw. He was the guy sleeping his way to the top. Up on the 50th floor, the situation was infinitely worse. Victoria sat at the head of the boardroom table, facing a hastily convened emergency meeting of the board of directors. Arthur Pendleton, the chairman of the board, a ruthless, 70-year-old titan of industry who had been trying to oust Victoria since her father died, was pacing the length of the room like a shark. "It is a textbook breach of fiduciary duty, Victoria," Pendleton snarled, tossing a printed copy of the tabloid onto the mahogany table. "You halted an $800 million project on the word of a mid-level engineer, doubled his salary, and 3 days later you are photographed at a 3-star Michelin restaurant with him. Do you understand the liability here?" "Arthur, the structural flaw was verified by an independent firm the following day," Victoria replied, her voice dangerously calm, though her knuckles were white as she gripped her pen. "Mr. Hayes earned his promotion on merit. The optics don't care about merit," Pendleton shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "Our shareholders are calling. Lockwood International is laughing at us. It looks like you are trading corporate capital for sexual favors. The board demands you terminate David Hayes immediately to mitigate the PR fallout." Victoria stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. She locked eyes with Pendleton, her gaze pure ice. "If you attempt to terminate David Hayes, I will publicly release the internal emails, proving the board tried to push through the Lakeside Pinnacle project, despite knowing about the substandard steel supplier. I will tank this company's stock myself before I let you fire an innocent man for a tabloid smear. Are we clear, Arthur?" The boardroom fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Pendleton glared at her, his face purple with rage, but he backed down. While Victoria fought her war in the sky, David's world was crumbling on the ground. At 2 p.m., a courier arrived at David's cubicle, dropping a thick, manila envelope on his desk. The return address made David's blood run cold. Reynolds, Hughes and Partners, Family Law. He ripped it open. It was a formal legal notice. His late wife's mother, Patricia Gallagher, belonged to the old money elite of the North Shore. She had never forgiven David for marrying her daughter and moving her to a middle-class life in Oak Park. When Sarah died, Patricia had subtly tried to gain custody of Chloe, but David had fought her off. Now she had ammunition. David read the petition, his heart pounding in his ears. Patricia was filing for an emergency custody hearing. The attached affidavit cited the tabloid articles, claiming David was living a chaotic, inappropriate lifestyle, parading a billionaire employer around, and creating an unstable, media-frenzied environment completely unsuitable for a grieving 7-year-old child. She's going to take Chloe. Panic, raw and suffocating, gripped him. He didn't care about the job, the money, or his reputation. He only cared about his daughter. The Gallaghers had unlimited financial resources. They could drag this out in family court for years, bleeding him dry until he had nothing left to fight with. He didn't think, he just acted. He printed out a single sheet of paper, signed his name at the bottom, and bypassed Pamela Davies, marching directly into Victoria's corner office. Victoria was on the phone, looking exhausted, but she hung up the moment she saw his face. "David, what's wrong?" He walked to her desk and placed the piece of paper in front of her. It was a letter of resignation. Victoria stared at it, her expression crumbling. "David, no, you don't have to do this. I handled the board. Arthur Pendleton won't touch you. I swear it." "It's not the board, Victoria," David said, his voice cracking. He tossed the legal petition from Reynolds, Hughes, and Partners next to his resignation. "It's my mother-in-law. She's using the paparazzi photos to petition for full custody of Chloe. She claims my life is an unstable media circus." Victoria picked up the legal document, her eyes scanning the brutal legal jargon. Her breath hitched. She knew exactly who Patricia Gallagher was, and she knew exactly how vicious high society custody battles could get. "I can hire the best lawyers in the country for you," Victoria pleaded, stepping around her desk, desperate to fix it. "I will pay for everything. We will crush her in court." "No!" David shouted, the sound echoing in the massive office. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, stepping back from her. "Don't you get it? Your money, your lawyers, your world, that is exactly what is being used against me. Every second I am associated with you, I give Patricia more ammunition to prove I'm caught up in a billionaire's crossfire." Victoria stopped dead in her tracks, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "I can't lose my daughter, Victoria," David whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "She is all I have left. I had a wonderful night with you, but I will not sacrifice Chloe for it. I resign, effective immediately. We sever all ties. It's the only way I can prove to a judge that I'm just a boring, normal dad." Victoria looked at the man she had just started to fall for, seeing the sheer terror of a father fighting for his child. She swallowed the massive lump in her throat, her own heart breaking, and nodded slowly. "I understand," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your resignation is accepted, Mr. Hayes." David turned and walked out of the glass doors, leaving his keycard on the receptionist's desk. As the elevator doors closed, taking David away, Victoria stood alone in her cavernous office. She looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline she practically owned. She had all the power in the world, and it had just ruined the life of the only decent man she knew. But Victoria Kensington had not built an empire by surrendering. The Iron Orchid dried her eyes, picked up her desk phone, and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Pamela," Victoria said coldly, "cancel my afternoon meetings and get me the private cell phone number for the senior partner at Reynolds, Hughes and Partners. It is time I had a conversation with Patricia Gallagher's lawyer." For 3 agonizing weeks, David lived in a state of suspended animation. He took a lower-paying job at a mid-sized municipal engineering firm, just to have an income on paper. He spent every evening helping Chloe with her spelling words, reading her stories about coral reefs, and holding her a little too tightly before bed. The looming custody hearing at the Richard J. Daley Center cast a dark, suffocating shadow over his modest Oak Park home. Patricia Gallagher had hired William Thorne, one of the most aggressive, high-priced family law attorneys in Cook County. David's own court-appointed lawyer had gently warned him to prepare for the worst. The tabloid photos, though fabricated in their context, painted a picture of a man swept up in a billionaire's chaotic orbit, which played perfectly into Patricia's narrative of instability. David hadn't heard a single word from Victoria. He assumed she had moved on, returning to her untouchable glass tower and her billion-dollar boardroom wars. It hurt, an ache that settled deep in his chest, but he told himself it was for the best. He had to be just a father. On a brisk Tuesday morning, exactly 48 hours before the scheduled custody hearing, David's cheap prepaid cell phone rang. It was his lawyer. "David, are you sitting down?" the lawyer asked, his voice laced with absolute bewilderment. David gripped the edge of his kitchen counter, his knuckles white. "What happened? Did they file an injunction?" "No," the lawyer breathed out. "They dropped it. The entire petition, withdrawn with prejudice. Patricia Gallagher's attorney just emailed the clerk. They are surrendering all claims to custody, and Patricia signed a legally binding non-interference agreement regarding Chloe. It's over, David. You won." David's knees buckled. He slid down the cabinet doors, hitting the linoleum floor as a massive, tearing sob ripped from his throat. The crushing weight of the past month dissolved in an instant. He didn't know how it had happened, and he didn't care. His daughter was safe. That evening, as David was making a celebratory batch of homemade macaroni and cheese, the doorbell rang. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened the heavy wooden door. He froze, Standing on his concrete porch was Victoria Kensington, but she looked entirely different. The severe, immaculate chignon was gone, her dark hair falling freely around her shoulders. The tailored, charcoal power suits had been replaced by a pair of faded denim jeans, a thick cream-colored knit sweater, and scuffed leather boots. Behind her, there was no Maybach, no chauffeur, and no security detail. Just a slightly dusty Volvo SUV parked by the curb. "Hello, David," Victoria said softly, her breath pluming in the cold October air. "Victoria," he managed to say, his voice thick with shock. What are you doing here?" She offered a small, nervous smile, shifting her weight. "I was hoping you might invite me in. It's freezing out here, and I can smell cheese." David stepped aside, utterly bewildered, and led her into the warm, slightly chaotic hallway. Chloe's sneakers were scattered on the rug, and a backpack was slumped against the wall. Victoria looked around the modest home, her eyes softening with a genuine warmth he hadn't seen since that night at Alinea. "Patricia Gallagher dropped the custody suit today," David said, leaning against the doorway. He crossed his arms, studying her carefully. "My lawyer said it was a miracle, but I know it wasn't a miracle, was it? It was you." Victoria looked down, tracing the grain of the wooden banister. "I didn't use my lawyers, David. I didn't bully her with Kensington Global's legal team. I did some quiet digging. I found out that Patricia's late husband's estate, which funds her entire North Shore lifestyle, was heavily leveraged in a commercial zoning fraud out in Evanston. A fraud that Lockwood International helped cover up." David stared at her, stunned by the sheer ruthlessness of Chicago real estate politics. "I visited Patricia privately," Victoria continued, meeting his gaze. "I told her that if she ever threatened you or Chloe again, I would hand the financial files over to the Cook County State's Attorney and the Chicago Tribune. She would lose her fortune, her social standing, and likely face federal indictment. She signed the non-interference agreement right there in her drawing room." "You blackmailed her?" David whispered, a mixture of shock and profound gratitude washing over him. "I leveled the playing field," Victoria corrected gently. "She tried to use her power to take away the most important thing in your life. I simply used mine to protect it." David stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. "Why, Victoria?" "I walked away. I resigned. Because I realized you were right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My world was toxic. It was a gilded cage built on transactions and leverage. When you walked out of my office to protect your daughter, it was the bravest, most honest thing I had ever seen a man do. It made me realize I didn't want to be the Iron Orchid anymore." She reached into her oversized sweater pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to him. It was a clipping from the morning's Wall Street Journal. The headline read, "Victoria Kensington steps down as CEO. Board appoints successor." "You quit?" David gasped, his eyes darting from the paper to her face. "You walked away from a $2 billion empire?" "I retained my shares, but I gave up the throne." Victoria smiled, looking lighter than she ever had. "I don't want to build glass monuments for the ultra-rich anymore, David. I'm starting a small, independent firm. We are going to design sustainable, affordable urban housing for working-class families in Chicago. Real homes for real people." She took a step closer, tentatively reaching out to rest her hand on his chest, right over his racing heart. "But to do that, I need a brilliant, uncompromising structural engineer. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when my math is wrong. Someone who puts people first." David looked down at the brilliant, beautiful woman standing in his hallway, stripped of her corporate armor and offering him a completely new life. He reached up, covering her hand with his own. "I think," David smiled, the heavy exhaustion finally leaving his eyes, "I could make time for an interview." From the kitchen, a small voice rang out. "Daddy, the mac and cheese is bubbling." Victoria laughed, a bright, genuine sound that filled the small house. "We better go check on that. I'd love to finally meet Chloe. Ultimately, their story proves that the most profound connections often arise when we stop trying to rigidly engineer our lives. David and Victoria dismantled both the corporate walls and personal defenses they had spent years building, discovering a messy, beautiful reality together. From a sterile Chicago boardroom to a chaotic, love-filled family kitchen, the ruthless billionaire and the exhausted single dad finally found their perfect, unexpected partnership.